Oh, it's going to be a great day today. I know it because you came to see my show. Thanks a lot. I'm John Merriman, and this is your Tuesday morning guitar song. Welcome to part 2 of the Beatles story. I did part 1 a couple of months ago. Today I'm going to age progress the Beatles. It's 1962. The Beatles have just gotten back from Hamburg, Germany, where they did their first gigs as a young band. They're settling in to becoming a club band in their hometown of Liverpool. Now, the Beatles were an incredibly tight bunch of kids back then. They cared for each other, they looked out for each other, and they all shared a common desire to be top of the pop charts someday. But what the Beatles didn't have at that time was 1 ounce of business sense. And there's a pretty good chance that they would have begun and ended their career in music as a club band in Liverpool if it wasn't for 2 strong men who came into their lives and formed, shaped, and created the Beatles as we know them today. They were Brian Epstein, their first manager, and George Martin, their record producer. Let's take a look at Brian Epstein. He lived in Liverpool. He was about 8 years older than John and Paul. His family ran a furniture store that was very successful, and they expanded to sell musical instruments and records. Brian was put in charge of the record department. Now, he had an incredibly sharp business mind, and he took that record department and turned it into one of the biggest record stores in northern England. He was the consummate young businessman. Now, the Beatles at that time were crazy and wild. They had terrible stage manners. They would swear and smoke on stage. They would eat while they were playing. They would push each other around and punch each other for fun. And they dressed like juvenile delinquents. Brian, the young, smart-looking businessman, went to see them at a concert one day at the Cavern Club. And he could see a real diamond in the rough in the Beatles. And he asked to manage them. Now, this was Brian's first foray into band management. He was a record store owner, but they agreed. And then Brian went to work cleaning up this little club band. He insisted on good manners. He insisted on mature behavior. Good luck with that one. He dressed them. He took them to his tailor, where he had those collarless Beatles suits made. He insisted they do the little synchronized bow at the end of each song. He told them what to say and when to say it. He was the one who shaped and formed the Beatles. He cleaned them up. And when he got them all scrubbed up, he took them down to London to get a record contract. In London were all the record companies in England, and things really started to go south. They went to London and they were turned down by every record company down there. They were auditioned, they were looked at, and they were not wanted. But there was one record company left, which Brian thought would never be appropriate, so he never even tried them. But it was the last day. They were going to go home empty-handed, so he thought, what the heck, I'll give this one last company a try. It was Parlophone Records. That was part of the EMI group, but it was different. It was tiny, and it did not specialize in music. It specialized in spoken word comedy albums, and that's why Brian never went there. So he went to see George Martin, who was the head of Parlophone Records, and pitched his cleaned up band to him. Well, George just happened to be looking for a musical act to expand his record label to include music, and in walks Brian with his band that no one wanted. Well, George thought he could get this band cheap, and what the heck, he didn't have much to lose, and it was true. The first Beatle contracts were just horrendous. Well, George signed the Beatles, and they became a client of the Parlophone record company. So, George took over now, but he was different than other business managers of the day. George was a classically trained professional musician. He was an oboe player. He was not a businessman. And he took his sophistication and his deep knowledge of music and applied it to his first little musical act. He gave the Beatles a sheen and an edge that was unheard of that day in pop music. He pushed here, he pulled there, he worked on quality control, song selection. He formed those Beatle albums, and he made incredibly good suggestions, like using the string quartet behind Paul during the song Yesterday. That was George Martin. He was like the secret weapon. He brought something to the Beatles that nobody else had, which was that high-class musical point of view. Well, so it was Brian Epstein who packaged them up, and then it was George Martin who shipped them out to the world. And that was the team that formed the Beatles as we know it. Now, the Beatles, through all this, were very innocent. They were just doing what they were told, and they were very happy because they were getting famous and selling a lot of records. But really, it did not serve them well in the long run, because when they had to manage their own business affairs later on, it really fell apart. They were just little lambs, and they didn't know what they were doing. But that's part 3, and I'm going to do that later on. Right now, I think it's time for your Tuesday morning fun fact. Here's your Tuesday morning fun fact. This is for all the Paul fans, of which I include myself. Here's the question. Where do you live if you're a Beatle? You have all the money in the world. You can go anywhere you want, and everybody's looking for you. Where do you live? Well, Paul had a very creative answer to this problem. Until 1966, and keep in mind that's halfway through the history of the Beatles, Paul lived in a small room in the attic of his girlfriend's parents' house. And to keep his anonymity, Paul would leave through a large window near the roof, cross over to the neighbor's house, go through their house, and exit through one of their doors. They had that all agreed on. Now, Hollywood could not have made this up. Paul was very interested in always keeping his image as the common working guy and not really being comfortable with all this crazy fame. So he stayed with his girlfriend, who was Jane Asher. And she lived with her parents in London, and they gave him this small room up in the attic. At that time, it would not have been appropriate for Paul to be staying in Jane's room, so he stayed upstairs. They kind of adopted Paul. I've always loved this story. It is such a telling story of the personality of Paul, and it leaves no doubt why Paul was always considered the thrifty Beatle. So there's your Tuesday morning fun fact. I think it's guitar playing time. I've got one of my favorite Beatles songs. It's from 1967 and the album Magical Mystery Tour. So please, stay with me. I'll be right back. Thank you so much for stopping by today. It's so good to see you. And thank you for all the comments you're leaving in the comments section. I love our discussions we get into about music. So go ahead and write something down there if the Spirit moves you. Please hit the like button. Share on your social media. We are a word-of-mouth operation. Call your mother if you haven't called her in a while. And please, come back next week and see me. And remember, you're never ready for your day without a song in your heart. Bye now.